Okay, thanks for your patience. I'm going to stop trying to make dad jokes the whole time and actually get to the presentation so I don't run out of time. So I like to open by asking everybody to just think about why we're here. We come to a show like Anime Expo for a pretty obvious reason, which is that we love anime and manga. But the reason why I like to do this panel is to give you all, and myself, a sense of the context, a sense of how we got here, a sense of the sequence of events literally going back centuries that result in you guys being here in this room for this reason. So what is manga? Manga is a Japanese term, literally meaning whimsical pictures. It's also the Japanese word for comics. Meaning that when you use it in Japan, it describes any kind of comic, not just a Japanese one. A superhero comic or The Walking Dead would be manga in Japan. But here, it means Japanese comics, or at least something that's heavily influenced by the Japanese style. And yes, if you're super into manga, that's controversial, but let's just roll with it. So who am I? So I've been working in manga publishing for about 20 years now. I started my career at Viz Media in 2000. From there, I founded the Del Rey Manga imprint in 2003. I co-founded 7 Seas in 2004 and helped to set up Kodansha Comics in 2010. In 2015, I headed over to Crunchyroll, where I headed up the events team and the manga team. And then left there last year and started my own company, Nonlinear World, this last year. Altogether, I have sold, edited, written, marketed, and or published over 3,000 volumes of manga, roughly. And actually have had the honor of appearing in a manga, which was the 13th volume of Hiro Mashima's Fairy Tale, where I was an extremely nervous, overweight bartender. And I never had any idea why I had a bottle tied to my head, but there you go. So how far back can we go? We're talking about the history of manga, right? And the truth of the matter is, if I wanted to, I could go back as far as this. We've been telling ourselves, humanity, we've been telling each other stories through pictures pretty much forever. We started with pictures before we had language. But once we started to include language and pictures being used together as a way of communication and storytelling has been around, in this case, literally for millennia. And even more recently in Europe in the 13th century, in the case of the Bayeux Tapestry, a scroll that actually depicts a famous war that I didn't write down, in England back in the day. But if I were to really spend a lot of time on this, we would not actually get to anything close to contemporary manga, and I have a long way to go. So the actual term manga started to be used in 1814. It was used by the famous Japanese artist Hokusai, and he did use it in the literal sense, whimsical pictures. And while you can see an element of manga, you can see an element of comics to what he was doing here, these were not sequential. These were single images, caricatures, line drawings, whatever you want to describe them as, that were used to depict something, but you did not go from panel to panel in the way you would in a comic. So we don't consider this a comic. We don't consider this contemporary manga, but it is where it is the origin of the actual term. So what we have to do here is interesting. In order to get to contemporary manga, and I swear to God, I'm going to try to breeze through everything up until the 20th century fairly quickly here, but we have to start with this guy. This is Wolfgang Adam Toepfler, a German tailor who was also a painter. Quite a good one, quite popular during his time. And he made his living in part off of his paintings. He had a son, and he also was famous for his caricatures. Comics, in the sense of the single panel, using a single panel to tell a story, that had existed before, but up to this point, nobody had still put the two together. But this is actually the inventor of the comic. This is the inventor of comics worldwide. It all started with this guy, Rudolf Toepfler, born in Switzerland, where his father had moved to, and very much somebody, from what I have read, and he wrote a lot of things about this at the time, very much wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. He was not able to. He ended up starting a boarding school instead when he was 20 years old. And the reason he couldn't follow in his father's footsteps is he loved art and he wanted to be an artist, but he had a degenerative eye disease. It was simply physically impossible for him to be able to draw or paint at the level of detail that his father could. But that love of art really stuck with him, and so he continued to do artwork for his students, again, following his father's style of caricatures, but in line drawings that simply did not require the level of fine detail that fine art would require. His students loved his work. He started in 1827, he did them for several years. You're familiar, of course, with the writer Goethe, who wrote Faust. Goethe was one of his friends, and one day, looking at his stuff, he said, "Dude, you should totally publish this. I would help you." He did. That's in the book. He actually wrote that. He actually said that. And this was the result. What Toepler did was he took some of his stories. I'm not even going to try to malign the French Swiss that he wrote it in, but translated, it was called The Story of Mr. Woodenhead. And you can see the elements of a comic are extremely clear. He is telling, there is a panel, there is some text to describe what's going on, and then you switch to another panel, and this is clearly conveying motion. You are clearly seeing that between panel 1 and panel 2, something has happened, and by panel 3, something has fallen apart and he's picking up his wagon. This was popular. This was really popular. This was insanely popular. This caught on immediately. There was no question. Nobody looked at this and questioned whether this was worthwhile. Nobody looked at it and said, well, this isn't text, this isn't prose, it's somehow not worthy of being called a book. No, the exact opposite. It was entirely new. It bred dozens, if not hundreds of competitors almost instantly. And it ended up being published worldwide. In fact, 5 years after its publication in Switzerland, it made it to the United States in 1842, where it was called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. All right, so let's jump back a little bit. I swear to God I'm going to get to the 20th century pretty soon here. Let's jump back a bit. So Japan, this is actually 17th century Japan. And during this time, they instituted what they called seppuku, which was quite literally the closing of the borders to anybody outside of the country. There was, in fact, a single port through which you were allowed to enter Japan. And in so doing, the country isolated itself for, in fact, over 200 years. But how did it open? Well, it opened when Commodore Matthew Perry, he wanted a trade route to China. That was his interest. He wanted to be able to get to China. Japan was right in the way and was a great place for him to stop and replenish his ships, but Japan wouldn't allow him to stop. So he came back, he went there in 1835, and he showed up with what are known as the Black Ships. What the Black Ships were, as you can see, many ships that kind of came in, sailed off the coast of Japan, and then just started shelling for 6 months until they ran out of ammunition. And they left, and they reloaded, and they came back, and they said, "We would like you to open your borders now, please." And the Japanese acquiesced. This happened in 1836, right? So 1837 is when that comic that I mentioned is published. 1842 is when it makes it to the United States. Basically, what happens at this time is now Japan is exposed to Western culture. Now, this, of course, has many long-reaching effects beyond the influence of comics, but obviously I'm not going to talk about those. I don't know that it was Toepler's comic that went into Japan. So many existed at that point that it could have been anything. But once it made it into Japan and it caught the Japanese imagination, again, just like in Europe, it caught on like wildfire and was hugely popular and almost immediately bred imitators. But the funny thing is, the first manga, what we can traditionally think of as manga to be published in Japan, was not actually published by the Japanese. It was published by a British guy who called it the Japan Punch. It published in 1862 and it ran for 25 years. Now, it did not stay the only manga for 25 years, but it was, again, a way that a lot of people in Japan started to become exposed to this way of telling stories. Okay, I am now moving into the 20th century. It only took me 8 minutes. So, 20th century. Japan, something that I should actually mention before going on into this. Something that you may or may not realize about manga and about reading in Japan. Japan is a much more literate culture than we are. At our peak in the United States, we have probably had about 6,000 to 7,000 bookstores in this country. And that's a country with, what are we, like 300 million people? I don't know. In Japan, at their peak, with a population of roughly like a half to a third of that, about 120, 130 million, at their peak, they were at 25,000 bookstores. So this is a country that, you know, without making any kind of a qualitative statement about it, this is a country that reads a lot. They still do, but this is a country that at the time was just really, really, really into books. So 1909. 1909, the company Kodansha is founded. It's founded by a gentleman named Seiji Noma. The Noma family has continued to run Kodansha since 1909. In fact, it's currently run by his great-grandson, Yoshinobu Noma, who's actually here at Anime Expo this year, checking out some of what Kodansha is doing. But more significantly for manga, they published their first weekly manga magazine in 1959. March of 1959 was when the first issue of Weekly Shonen magazine came out. Now, just quickly, of course you're familiar with Shonen Jump. Shonen, of course, meaning like for boys. The funny thing about Weekly Shonen magazine is that the name of the magazine is magazine. The name of the magazine, Shonen Jump, is Jump. So if you were to like belabor the point, you would be Shonen Jump magazine, if you really wanted to call it what it was. This is an issue of Shonen magazine. Shogakukan was founded in 1922, but seeing the writing on the wall and perhaps even hearing that Kodansha was about to release a weekly manga magazine, they did the exact same thing. In the exact same month, they started releasing this on a weekly basis, and this, of course, was Weekly Shonen Sunday. Shueisha was not founded until 1925, and it wasn't until 9 years after these guys that they entered the market with Weekly Shonen Jump. Now, a funny story about Shueisha, and I got this when I was working at Viz, so I believe it's true, but it's still anecdotal, so I'm not going to swear on a stack of Bibles. But you know, Shogakukan and Shueisha are actually owned by the same family, so they are sister companies, even though clearly they are in competition with each other. And it's a funny thing, the rivalry between them is really intense. I mean, when I was working at Viz, 20 years ago, I was there when Shueisha came and became a co-investor in Viz, which had previously been solely a Shogakukan subsidiary for like 15 years. And it shocked everybody. I mean, we were just completely stunned. And eventually I found out, I was so curious, if they're owned by the same parent company, I mean, I get it, they can compete with each other, but why would there just be this intense rivalry between them? And what I was told was, back in the day, 20, 30, 50 years ago, when you had a job in Japan, that job was for life. You really couldn't get fired unless you did something really awful. But at the same time, work is work, and not everybody worked out. And so if at Shogakukan they had people that weren't working out, this is what every company would do in Japan, they transfer them to another division. Well, at Shogakukan they transferred them to Shueisha. Think about that for a second. And imagine over the decades, a company that comes to be made up largely of people who were essentially let go from the exact same company. And all of a sudden, the source of the rivalry starts to become a little more clear. So I think everybody's familiar with what modern day manga magazines look like, and I am just really curious. You guys can see here, you've probably noticed that they are different colors. You've got these different colors in the same magazine, these big, 500-600 page magazines. Does anybody know why they're different colors? Any ideas? Yeah.
I learned at your panel last year.
No, you know the answer, and you were at the panel last year, and that's cheating. Thank you for telling me that. And I will not listen to you, young man. Okay, I'm not going to give anybody else a chance to spoil it. Okay, it's a guess. I will listen to this one. Go ahead.
Marketing versus stories.
And that is actually what most people think it is, and that makes perfect sense, that this would change per story, right? That you'd get 20 pages of one, and then you'd switch to another story, and you'd switch to another color, and it would make it easier to flip through, and all of that. That's the logical reason, and so of course it has nothing to do with why there are colored pages there. It's a legacy of Japanese manga publishing post-World War II. They did not, and not even just post-World War II, but initially they were publishing during a paper shortage, and so they had to make do with whatever paper they could get. They didn't know when they were starting out that they were going to eventually reach circulation in the millions, because that's certainly not where they started when they first published. So these magazines weren't the highest priority. So they didn't order paper for these magazines. They went to the plants and they pulled whatever paper they had. Well, that paper wasn't always the same color. Now, of course, today, again, we're talking about magazines with a circulation between 1 and 2 million here, at least among these three. There is no longer any need to do this, but it's what they did for over a decade, so it just became part of the legacy of publishing magazines like this in Japan. So when we think of modern manga, really this is the place to start. This, of course, is Osamu Tezuka. He was born in 1928. He was just a huge manga fan. I mean, honestly, he was just a huge otaku about manga in general. His mother would take him to the theater, to kabuki, and to different types of performances, and he just really became enamored. He said he became really enamored with storytelling as a result of that. His father would take him to Disney movies, and in fact, Disney movies, and not just Disney, but actually Betty Boop, the fact that they use such large eyes to convey the emotions of the characters, he really liked that, so he started to kind of imitate that. And of course, that caught on, and that became, and still is today, the way a lot of manga and anime are done, with those larger eyes, and that's simply largely because of Tezuka. Because when he came along, and I'll get onto this in a second, he completely rocked the manga world. It was very different before he came along. But how he got into it, I just find completely fascinating. I mean, he published, until his death in 1989, 700 works, 200,000 pages of work that he did. He broke out in 1946 with New Treasure Island. And at the same time, right before that, he started medical school. He was not actually initially thinking that he would be a mangaka full-time. His thought was that he would be a doctor. But throughout medical school, he continued to draw manga, and when in his second year of school, he actually published manga, and that manga had some success. And yet, let's be clear, it was no indication he was going to make as much money doing manga as he would as a doctor. When I say success, I don't mean that he suddenly was rolling in money, far from it. He was faced with a very difficult decision, and again, this is a story he would tell, and I just personally love this one, because at that crossroads in his life, when he graduated and he now had to decide, would he go on, continue his training and become a doctor, or would he devote his life to manga? He went to his mom, and he said, "Mom, what do I do?" And she said, "You should do what you love. Whatever it is you like doing most is what you should do." And clearly he liked manga, and that's what he chose. And you'll see what I'm trying to get to at a number of points in this talk, and certainly this is one, and this is just something that personally fascinates me, is that these are those pivot points. When I ask you, like, why are we here? Literally, what if his mom had said, "Listen, manga's great, but you gotta eat, and you should be a doctor." I'm not saying we wouldn't have manga. I'm not saying we wouldn't necessarily be here, but I can say to you that had he not made that decision in that moment to devote his life to manga, nothing out here would be here. Dragon Ball would not be here. Boruto, Soul Eater. If I keep trying to name titles, I'm going to run out and get them wrong, but yes, all of those. None of those would be here if not for that moment in time and other moments like it.
One quick point. You forgot to mention he actually did not give up being a doctor. He actually continued on and got his full doctorate for advanced research. and continued his medical studies all through his career simultaneously.
And just to repeat that, because that's true, I did not mention that, he did not abandon his medical studies. He continued, got his doctorate, and continued his medical research throughout his year, and of course that manifested most clearly in Blackjack, which is, oh yeah, no, it's one of my favorites. The scene where Blackjack is caught in the Australian outback, and he has to pull a parasite out of his own stomach, and he erects a dome to protect himself, and as he's cutting himself open, the wild dingoes get the scent of his blood and are trying to tear through to eat him. Oh my God. Awesome. But that's why I don't go into too much detail on these things. Okay, so we've been in the US so far. Let's jump over to, I'm sorry, we've been in Japan so far. Let's jump over to the US for a minute. Oh, by the way, what time do I have to wrap up? Is it 10 minutes before the hour or 15? Okay, no problem. I'll plan on 15. So 1963, Tezuka gets into making anime, and this, of course, is another pivotal moment that changes the way everything happens with manga and anime. Tezuka's no dope. He doesn't come into it thinking to himself, I am going to make some bucks off this anime thing. I'm going to put this on TV and you know, I'm going to make money off of this thing. No, he looks at Astro Boy, his pride and joy, and he says, how can I make more people aware of this? How can I promote this? I know everybody watches TV. I'll make a cartoon because then I'll sell more manga. This is actually an attitude, again, I've worked with manga publishers for a long time now. This is actually an attitude that still exists. And I'm not making a qualitative judgment of that, but I am saying that for manga publishers, that is largely what anime is. Anime is a way to get more people interested in the manga because that's what their focus is. And it all started here. Oh, at 1 p.m.? Oh, I got plenty of time. All right, let's slow this puppy down. 1978, the first manga is officially, I'm doing air quotes because I'm sure you could find something in a magazine or something in an anthology that was published before this, but the first manga graphic novel, solely the manga, was published here in the US in 1978. This was Barefoot Gen. This, of course, if you haven't read it, it's good. It's absolutely heartbreaking. It's a difficult read because it's the story, it's an autobiographical story of the author living through the bombing of Hiroshima. And so it's not too surprising. I think it was published, I don't remember which one, but I believe it was published by a university press, and it was used as kind of a social studies scholarly work. But again, 1978 is the first manga that gets published here. Okay, I'm going to jump back to Japan, and then from here on I'm going to stick in the US for the whole rest of the way. So in Japan, in the 1980s, a couple of things are happening that are clearly going to have a huge impact. This being, again, a couple more pivot points where things really, really shift. Akira Toriyama was working at an ad agency in the 1970s, and he entered a contest, manga contest with Shonen Jump. And as we all know, he lost. And they did not select his manga, but he actually developed a relationship with his editor, and in 1978 debuted Wonder Island. It was his first series. He went on to do a few more things, but in 1980 he had Dr. Slump, his gag manga, and that, of course, became a big hit. Of course, that was nothing compared to what would happen in 1984 when he started Dragon Ball. You're aware, of course, if you've watched or read Dragon Ball, that it starts out really just as a comedy. It's not to say that there aren't action-adventure elements, they're pretty strong. But really, the emphasis here is on comedy. It's much more like Dr. Slump than it is what Dragon Ball would become. But as he continued to do it, and as he started to realize that when he did battles, this is when like sales would pop up and people were interested, he started to shift it more in that direction, and it eventually became a battle-focused manga. But it's not how it started. In 1984, when it started running in Shonen Jump, the Shonen Jump circulation was 3.9 million copies a week. Which, by the way, in any standard, any country, including the US, that's phenomenal. At its peak, during the heyday of a magazine like People, we were talking about 2 or 3 million copies, and I'm talking like 20, 30 years ago. This is 3.9 million copies of this magazine, and it was only the beginning. By 1995, when DBZ was wrapping up, it had climbed to 6.5 million copies. Now, that wasn't the only title doing well, but when it wrapped up, sales dropped, and when Slam Dunk, which was in the same magazine and in some ways equally as popular and influential, ended in 1996, the following year, circulation on Shonen Jump dropped down quite a bit, to the point now where it's at about 2.8 million, and it's in decline largely owing to the kind of shrinking of the Japanese population. That I could go on about at length, but I'll save that for the talk at 6 o'clock tonight. Meanwhile, Naoko Takeuchi, I'm sorry, was studying chemistry and was actually working as a shrine maiden before she started working on manga. She submitted manga to Kodansha, and they were gag pieces, just kind of like what Toriyama was doing. They were accepted and they were published. Her first long series that she did was the Cherry Project, which was an ice skating story. And then she went to her editor and she said, okay, I really want to do now a sci-fi adventure series. That's what I want my next project to be. And her editor said, okay, whatever you do, and I'm not kidding here, just put them in sailor suits. And she did. And the rest is history. It was a little more complicated than that. The first two books that she did in the series were codenamed Sailor V, focusing on Venus and not on Sailor Moon. And after she finished those, she was done. She actually wasn't planning to go back to it. But when Toei picked up the rights to do the animation, she decided that she would return to it, and that's how the full Sailor Moon series came to be. Now, the impact that these had on the market, I don't think I actually really have to tell you. I mean, it wasn't just in Japan. I mean, in Japan, the impact was huge. I mean, we're still, 35 years later, still, like Naruto, Boruto, I mean, Dragon Ball Super, but that's cheating. So many things are based on the success of Dragon Ball and what Dragon Ball did and what it became. Likewise, on the shoujo side, we see so much magical girl stories out there. Sailor Moon was not the first, but it was the one that lit the fire. It was the one that caught everybody's imagination. And now we're back to the United States. And this is where I'm going to take a bit of a hard right in terms of what I'm talking about and talk to you for a second about the fascinating topic of American comic book distribution. So this is a comic book store. This is obviously the 1950s, but this is a comic shop. This is not a comic shop. This is a convenience store. This is like the equivalent of a 7-Eleven. And this is how comic books were distributed in the United States. As single issue comics, 10, 15, 25, 50 cents, whatever. Fairly disposable, really just there to be read and tossed aside. But in the 1980s, Diamond Comic Distributors came along and changed that. They helped to reform the traditional comic shop as we see it today. But this is the late 1970s, early 1980s, and graphic novels, though they exist, are not really a thing yet. So it's all about those individual comics. Meanwhile, in the 1980s in the United States, anime is starting to make its way onto TV. Now, of course, we've had other things besides Astro Boy, but when you talk to people, who grew up during this era, and I'm certainly one of those in the late 70s and 80s, when things like Star Blazers and Robotech and even Battle of the Planets came along, for kids, they were revolutionary. They were groundbreaking. American cartoons did not run. They were not serials. They had a story, and by the end of it, everything was completely reset. You don't need to have watched that episode to have watched the next episode. You could watch any episode out of order. It made no difference whatsoever. So to actually have something that was more soap opera-like, that actually picked up from chapter to chapter, really started to make an impact on the US market. Also happening in the 1980s, this is when graphic novels really start to become a thing. And on the American side, this is when we see the debut of Watchmen, we see Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, and we see Art Spiegelman's Mouse. And really at this point, it's the dawn of a new era. This is when comics and graphic novels in particular are really starting to make their way into bookstores, traditional bookstores, as well as comic book stores. We also see in the 1980s, Torrin Smith, who passed a few years ago, found Studio Proteus. Now, Torrin basically is who, as a comics fan, looked at what was happening with manga in Japan and said, we should be doing this. We should be publishing this. And shortly after that, he helps to get involved with this. First Comics, a comics publisher that went out of business a long time ago, publishes Lone Wolf and Cub. Now, remember what I said about how comics were distributed at that time. Although graphic novels existed, they weren't the main method of consumption. The main method of consumption was individual issues. Well, it's kind of distributed the same way in Japan, but not exactly. Those big magazines have single chapters. Sometimes they're weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. So what they started to do was release these chapters as individual comic books into the American market. This is one of the first. And Frank Miller, believe it or not, had a lot to do with introducing manga to the United States, because Lone Wolf and Cub might have gone completely unnoticed were it not to come out just a year or two after he did Dark Knight Returns, and he drew the cover because he really liked the comic. And so it got a lot of attention and really helped to move manga along in the US. In 1987, Viz enters into the scene. They come in and they co-publish with a company called Eclipse Comics, also again, long out of business. They publish everything as single-issue stories. This is something, by the way, that works fine if it was published in Japan in a monthly magazine. It basically means it was designed to be read a chapter a month. But when they started moving on to things like Dragon Ball and releasing them as individual issues, it got pretty messy, because Dragon Ball is meant to be read every week. You're not supposed to wait a month between chapters. And when you do, it throws the pacing of the story off pretty substantially. And so as a comic, Dragon Ball never really caught on until it hit anime. In 1988, Studio Proteus, Torrin Smith, they set up a deal for manga at Innovation, again, they're out of business, and Dark Horse, who are still publishing manga to this day, and these are some of the titles that they pick up. And in 1989, Viz actually parts way with Eclipse and starts to do its own thing completely. So throughout the 90s, you do see a fair amount of manga, not a huge amount, but it's basically a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. Now, in the case of Dragon Ball, like I said, it's not very successful. Reading Dragon Ball a chapter at a month is not satisfying. For Oh My Goddess and for Ranma, it works better. Ranma is comedy. It's not really an ongoing story, so that's okay. And Oh My Goddess was actually published, I believe, I could be wrong, but in a bi-weekly or a monthly magazine. Akira is really interesting because, of course, the first publisher for Akira in the United States was Marvel Comics. And when they published it, they colorized it. And you can see why, based on what was happening at the time. At the time, I'm overstating, but most American comics were in color. Black and white was actually seen as inferior in some way, like it was lower quality somehow. So when they brought Akira in, they added color. Now this could have gone very, very badly, but the good news is that it didn't. It didn't go badly. Steve Oliff was the colorist on that. He did a fantastic job. He did such a great job that they ended up eventually collecting those issues and re-releasing them in Japan in that colorized version, because it just really added something to the story, to the presentation of the art. All right, so 1990s, late 1990s, this is when Mix enters into the business. Now, of course, Mix is the name of the magazine, Mix is the name of the company, but they're about to become better known as Tokyopop. They come in, they do their own manga magazine. It is a total hodgepodge, as you can see from looking here. You have Sailor Moon and Magic Knight Ray Earth, and okay, I can see those two being in the same magazine. Ice Blade, probably not, but okay. Parasite is a grotesquely horrific horror story. It's awesome, and one of my favorite manga. I wouldn't put it in the same magazine as Sailor Moon, but that's just me. But 1997 is when Tokyopop enters the scene. They end up publishing all of these as graphic novels, and this is when the American manga market starts to really change. Up until this point, manga American publishers have been trying to make manga work in the only market they know how to work in, and that's the comic book store. But the comic book store environment is a rigged system for a very interesting reason. When a store owner buys comics, even today, to bring into their store, they get a great discount on them, greater than 50%, which is more than the standard discount. They usually get more like 60%, but they are non-returnable. Now, when something is non-returnable, that means that you literally cannot afford to take big risks. And so what happens is, this is how the modern comic book store comes to look the way it does. When you think of a comic book store, you generally think of superheroes. Well, there's a reason for that, because superheroes sold. And so comic shops played it safe for decades. And as manga started to grow, in fact, they got left behind because they didn't understand and they didn't want to take the chance. Now, bookstores are different. When we talk about something like a Barnes & Noble or an Amazon, it's completely different. Publishers sell their works to them on a returnable basis. This means that bookstores have no problem taking a risk on bringing in a lot of books, because if you're a publisher, the risk is entirely yours. It's not theirs. If they choose to bring in, and yes, I've had this happen, 10,000 copies of your book, and they sell 1,000, well, no big deal for them. They'll just ship 9,000 back to you and keep your profit margins, and anyway. But here's what happened, right? So, Tokyopop does Mix Magazine, and this is, I should throw some names in here too. It was Stu Levy, of course, who founded Tokyopop. He follows the Japanese model. He collects these as trade paperbacks, tankobon, graphic novels. But then he takes it one step further. And what he does is he creates the first, literally the first cardboard display to go into a bookstore chain that focused on comics. Ever. It was the first time that had ever happened. And lo and behold, what happened in that bookstore, and it was primarily Walden Books that worked with that. Does anybody here remember Walden Books? Oh my God, that's way too many hands, I'm so old. Walden Books in the 80s and 90s was a chain of bookstores primarily based in malls. And so it was pretty common in most large malls to find a Walden Books there. Well, Walden Books did phenomenally well with manga. I mean, just incredibly well. The buyer there at the time was a man named Kurt Hassler. Kurt would eventually go on to leave and actually co-found Yen Press over at Hachette, where he's still working as the publisher. But at the time, he had a great deal of foresight. He saw what this was doing, and he didn't see it as a fad. He thought this was going to do better. And so he continued to bring this stuff in. And that one display was, oddly enough, one of those pivotal game-changing moments, because what nobody understood up until that point, I was part of conversations at the time being in the business, and I hate having to say this out loud. Throughout the 90s, it was pretty clear that women didn't read comics. Now, there are a lot of reasons for women not to read comics at the time, right? I mean, most of them are superhero comics. Most of them objectify women in some way. Most of them are male power fantasies. Comic shops at the time, and sometimes even today, are not welcoming places for women. You walk in, and it's all a bunch of dudes who just turn and look because a woman has walked in, because it's so unusual. But at comics publishers, like Marvel and DC, I talked to a few of them at the time, the belief was that women, girls, did not like comic books. That was, and I swear to God, an editor actually said this to me, that their brains were wired differently than men's. And when they tried to reach a female audience, the only thing they could think to do before manga came along was to get the Barbie license and do comics that way. So they had left this incredibly fertile market just sitting there. And it was just waiting for somebody to come in, because of course, girls love comics. I mean, my daughter is 7 years old, she likes comics. I had a kid version of this conversation with her where I said there were people who thought that girls wouldn't like comics. And she just laughed in my face and said, "That's stupid, Daddy." Of course, when they did the redesign of Superman and they took away his red shorts, and then they brought the red shorts back and she saw that for the first time, she laughed and asked why Superman was wearing his underwear on the outside. But anyway. So in the late 1990s, this is basically the tidal wave is coming. Everything I've told you is kind of setting up the pieces for manga and anime to become really significant in the United States. In the 1998, Toonami brings a couple of small anime onto their Cartoon Network brings a couple of small anime onto their channel under the Toonami block. And of course, I'm joking. These ended up being really, really big. I'm trying to check how many digressions I can do, but I like this one. So I was working with Cartoon Network at the time, and these Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon were equally popular. They were both huge. But what was fascinating at the time, I found out, was that Dragon Ball Z, when they both aired, they did great the first time. Dragon Ball Z in reruns would do just fine. It would go down a little bit, but people would just keep rewatching it. Sailor Moon would not. It would do phenomenally well when it would launch, but people didn't watch the reruns very much. And their theory, which I tended to agree with, was simply that was a difference between boys and girls, in that boys were whatever enough, they were willing to just sit and watch the same thing over and over again. And girls actually wanted to watch something new. So, another pivot point, this is when everything really changes, and this is where the modern anime and manga market really starts to happen, and that's in 1999 when Pokemon debuts. Pokemon becomes the first true mass market success of anime, and it becomes the gateway drug for a lot of people. It becomes the thing where people, kids especially, they're watching it, they think it's amazing. And they find out that there's more. They find out that there's other stuff like this. And not just Digimon, which is awesome, but things like Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. And this is the point at which it starts to become much more broadly adopted. But I'm not here just to talk about anime, and I want to get back to manga now, because this is when things start to really happen for manga as well. We enter into a period, and this is the point at which I entered the market in terms of working in the field. We enter a period when manga is about to just grow at a geometric rate. I mean, like doubling in the tens of millions of dollars per year. And leading the charge for that is Tokyopop. Tokyopop comes out with their brand of 100% authentic manga. They encourage everyone to join the manga revolution. And I guess overturn the proletariat, I'm not sure. But the hilarious thing about their whole 100% authentic manga is that it is a fantastic tagline for something that they were doing that was actually just a cost-cutting measure. What they did was they stopped flipping the pages. Up until this point, they stopped flipping the pages so they would read from left to right. That was what everyone was doing. Everyone was taking the original, literally by the way at the time, before that in the 1990s, it was the literal film. They would take the film, and when they would go to print the page, they would turn it upside down. And now, everything was reversed. This led to a really funny thing I heard Carl Horn, who's at Dark Horse now, did when we were working at Viz. He was the editor on Eagle, the making of an Asian American president, which is really good. And it was published flipped to read from left to right. But the problem was that it was set in America. So when you had people driving, in the Japanese version, they were on the right-hand side of the road. But when you flipped it, now the image was flipped and they were driving on the left-hand side of the road. And so what he ended up doing, and again, this is before the digital era really took place, he sat there, this is just Carl, he sat there with an X-Acto knife and he cut out each panel individually and then flipped it back. Every time there was a scene with a car, and it needed to be clear the car was on the right-hand side. I shouldn't say it needed to be clear. There is no point at which it was relevant to the story that the car was on the right-hand side of the road, but he was very detail-oriented, he still is. Walden Books, as I mentioned, this was at the forefront of the success of manga. And when you think about it, and you think about the era, it's early days for the internet, and the audience for manga then and now is largely teens. And where are teens hanging out in 2001 and 2002? They're hanging out at the mall. And so they're discovering these things at Walden Books in a way that it's not happening necessarily at Barnes & Noble or at the time Borders. So Walden Books was absolutely key for this to work. Now in 2002, which is when we started keeping track of these things, the annual sales for manga in the United States hit $60 million, which was really good. Oh, and there's a picture of that display that I mentioned. That actually, it's really funny. Adam, I'm forgetting his last name, who works at Seven Seas. I looked online to try to find this display. This looks like it's a picture of a bookstore. This is actually his home. I totally stole this because I could put it up and say, oh yeah, no, it's a bookstore, yeah. In 2003, Viz finally starts to catch up. It's very interesting that at the time, the main thing we had to rely on, and we still do, to find out how manga was doing within the business was a service called BookScan. It's run by Nielsen, and it's very similar to the Nielsen television ratings. And at the time, I was starting to get feedback outside of the company. I was there, I was the sales and marketing manager or director or something. I handled sales. And I started to get feedback that it was possible that Tokyopop was starting to outsell us. And I shouldn't say who, I won't throw any names around. Somebody there said, no, that's not possible. That's not actually possible. Well, what Tokyopop was doing was their authentic manga. And I'm sorry, I didn't actually go into all the detail. The way that was a cost-cutting measure was they didn't flip the pages, so they didn't have to do that. They didn't translate any of the sound effects, which I just find abhorrent as an editor because I like to know what they say. You don't have to redraw them, but I do like to know what they say. But really significantly, they lowered the price point to $9.99. And that was huge because this book, Ranma 1/2, this was a $17 book when it came out. Also, funny thing, a conversation that I had at Viz one day, I've never been able to find, I can't find this cover because it never went out into the public, but this cover, every cover looked like this. Literally, exactly like this. Different color background, different image in the top. Well, one time the image at the top was really large, and I looked at it, and even though it was like volume 11 or something, I went to the designer and I said, what do you think is wrong with this? And they said, nothing, there's nothing wrong with this. And I said, it's covering the title of the book. It's great if you read the other 12 volumes and you know this is a Ranma book, but you can't assume that. They ended up completely redesigning the Viz line. Viz ended up going down to the $9.99 price point. Again, I'm oversimplifying and bringing it back down, because this was also a larger trim size. This was closer to 6x9, and they went down to something more like this, 5x7.5. Around this time, 2003, the first manga magazine since Mix comes out. Mix is gone by this point. This is a weekly magazine called Raijin. It's actually made up from a company that was made up from people who had left Shueisha, and they actually kind of wanted to one-up Shueisha and get this magazine into the market in the US first, and that's actually why this happened. Shonen Jump is something that Shueisha was planning to launch here for some time, but they were not in any hurry to do it. They became in a hurry when their ex-editors said, okay, well then we'll do it ourselves. Raijin got out before Shonen Jump, no question, but Raijin went out with Basketball Dude on the cover. No, that's Slam Dunk. I'm making fun of Slam Dunk. I should not be making fun of Slam Dunk. How many of you have heard of Slam Dunk? Okay, that's pretty good. But out in the rest of the world, nobody's heard of Slam Dunk, but they had heard of Dragon Ball. So Shonen Jump did really well, and obviously continued to be published in print for some time before shifting to digital, where Raijin lasted about 1.5 years, because it just didn't have any titles big enough to keep the interest high enough. 2004, everybody starts getting in the business, including me. I started Seven Seas, along with Jason DeAngelis, to take advantage of the fact that the market was growing at such a phenomenal rate that you could literally publish anything, and it would sell well. In 2002, I said it was 60 million. 2003, it was 85 million. 2004, it's 135 million. It's 100% growth in just 2 years, and it's not at its peak yet. I just put that in there because I wrote that one. CMX comes on. DC Comics comes into the scene. Kind of like Raijin, they decide that they should lead with a 20-year-old manga about a gay ballet dancer, which, again, not a qualitative judgment, but not something the market was clamoring for in 2004. So they were out of business a couple of years later. I ended up leaving Seven Seas. Actually, okay, it's complicated and I don't have enough time. Let's just say I did them both at the same time. And I worked with Random House to found Del Rey Manga, where we were able to pick up from some of the success that Tokyopop had and bring out Clamp and Ken Akamatsu's new books. Now, 2005, honestly, everybody starts getting into the business. Viz goes ahead and partners with Simon & Schuster for their book distribution. That's pretty significant. They're a really big publisher, and it means their books are going to get out to a lot more places. Tokyopop partners up with HarperCollins. Yen Press is formed. Kurt Hassler leaves Borders of Walden Books and starts to form Yen Press, licensing primarily from Kadokawa and Square Enix. Tokyopop, having lost a number of its licenses, starts its Rising Stars of Manga program in an effort to bolster the efforts of mangaka in the United States. It sees mixed results. Some do really well. Some are still making manga to this day. Svetlana Shmakova is a really accomplished artist and graphic novelist. And a lot of them, just by the nature of the beast, are not titles that you would necessarily have heard of today. They just kind of went away. The number of books being released is starting to go beyond the market's capacity to sell. Like I was saying, in 2002, 3, 4, you could literally release anything. You did not have to think about whether or not it would sell. It would sell in enough numbers because everything made it to the shelf. But in 2004, that number was like 800. In 2008, it hit 1,700, it more than doubled. And there now was no longer enough space on the shelf, and now bookstores were starting to say no to some manga. So things were starting, the market was starting to mature at this point. An odd place, Suncoast Video doesn't exist anymore, became a major outlet for manga, back to that point I made about malls earlier. Anime starts to really, really hit big on Toonami. Adult Swim is happening. I'm getting the 2-minute warning, which is why I'm talking so fast. Death Note comes, Borders starts to get a little rocky. This is 2007. They're starting to show signs of going out of business. Walden Books is pretty much gone at this point. Borders has taken over at like 25% of the manga market. Barnes & Noble, though, has caught on. They're doing really well with it as well, and we're now seeing permanent manga fixtures appearing in the bookstores. The market size now, remember I started it at $60 million. In 2007, it's at $210 million. But that's pretty much the end of that. 4Kids does come out, keep doing anime, but it's starting to have less of an effect. Borders, in a lot of trouble. One manga, Manga Piracy, really starts taking off and starts to have an impact on manga sales, and the recession comes. And 2008 turns out to be the biggest year we're going to have. 2009, 2010, everybody's talking about Tokyopop being on the rocks. Viz starts having to lay people off. Kodansha and Random House in 2010, it's no longer a licensing relationship, and Kodansha will now do their own books, but with Random House. And in 2011, the market is now down to $75 million. Borders goes out of business. That 30% of manga sales, it just goes away. People from that point, a few of them go and find their manga somewhere else. They either stop reading it or they go to piracy. And the numbers go down. Remember though, we are still at a really bad recession, so there's not a lot of money to go around, but manga gets hit really hard. Tokyopop shuts down its North American publishing operation, but there's some bright spots too. Vertical starts up in that time. 7 Seas is doing really well, and Yen Press, they're very strong. That was my 1 p.m. I'm going to do the rest of this in 30 seconds or less. Sailor Moon gets a re-release. Viz actually starts to pick up, and the next big game changer is coming. Digital starts to make a really big difference. Attack on Titan. Jeez, I don't even remember I had these slides in here. Attack on Titan is coming. This is going to be the big game changer. It reawakens interest in manga and anime across the board. Now, I could go through everything else, but let me just end it with this. Since 2012, the market has continued to grow, and in 2018, My Hero Academia represents 12 of the top 20 manga sold. Junji Ito is a massive success without any anime, which is a phenomenon unto itself, and the market size is back up to 140 million and growing. Guys, thank you so much for your patience. I'm going to remind you one more time that I'm doing a numbers panel tonight at 6, and thank you so much, everybody.